Okay, in case you missed Zoom class Thursday, April 9, this is what we covered. Setting the stage for slavery. There are many stories about slavery in the English colonies, but many are untrue. When the first colonies were still young, the colonists struggled to grow enough food. Learning how to grow tobacco and export it to make money helped. However, they needed more people to work on the farms. Many colonists weren't used to this kind of work and were frustrated by it. The colonists couldn't enslave enough Native Americans. The colonists brought white servants from England, but there weren't enough of them, and after a few years' work, they were free. By then, Spain and Portugal had enslaved and sent almost 1 million Africans to their colonies in the Caribbean and South America. The North American colonists soon turned to slavery as well. Fact finder. The first Africans in Jamestown were not slaves. They were indentured servants who were freed when their duties were complete. In 1641, Massachusetts became the first state to make slavery legal. Irish in America. One persistent myth about slavery in the colonies is that there were also Irish slaves. While people did sometimes call Irish immigrants white slaves in the 1600s and 1700s, most were in fact indentured servants who came to the colonies willingly, although some were put into servitude and taken to the colonies against their will. Indentured servitude was still temporary, and servants had rights. It also wasn't hereditary. So hereditary means passed down from one generation to the next. So if you were an indentured servant and you had a child, your child wasn't going to automatically be an indentured servant. The Dutch played a large part in the slave trade, transporting about 600,000 Africans to the islands in the Caribbean, where they were shipped to Spanish colonies. From servant to slave. The colonies continued to grow. The growth of plantations in the southern colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas created a desire for more slaves. Slave ships carried Africans chained together like cattle into the New World in horrible conditions. However, before the American Revolution, slavery existed in every colony, even in the North. New York and Boston had large slave populations working as household servants and in many other jobs. In fact, 14% of the population of New York was made up of slaves in 1750. The colonies didn't start abolishing slavery until Vermont did so in 1777, after the Revolution had started. Some attitudes started to change because the colonists saw that their own fight for freedom contradicted in many ways the practice of slavery. So that means that they started to realize that, hey, if they're fighting for freedom, but they're making slaves not have freedom, that kind of doesn't make sense. Fact finder. In 1781, Massachusetts, the first colony to legalize slavery, became the second state to abolish it. Still, it took years for all the slaves there to be freed. So abolish it means to get rid of it. The South had more slaves because the plantations needed so much labor to keep them running. A revolution approaches. There are many common stories about the colonies and the Revolutionary War, but not all those stories are true. There weren't even 13 colonies when the war began with the battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775. Delaware was part of Pennsylvania, although it had its own legislature, until June 15, 1776. It broke away from the other colonies and Great Britain at the same time, and years later, it was the first state to ratify or approve the U.S. Constitution. Also, the colonies didn't officially become independent on July 4, 1776. Colonial representatives voted to break away from Great Britain on July 2, 1776, and they approved the Declaration of Independence 2 days later. The colonies weren't truly free from Britain until the war was over and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Contrary to stories, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, didn't ring to mark independence on July 4, 1776. It wasn't even called the Liberty Bell until the 1830s, when it became a symbol of freedom in the anti-slavery movement. Siding with the enemy. It's easy to believe that all the residents of all 13 colonies banded together to declare their independence against the tyrant king of England. But the truth is that not every colonist wanted to break away. Even the founding fathers tried to mend fences with England first. Once the war started, about a third of the colonists were loyalists, meaning they were loyal to the king. This group included many wealthy merchants and businessmen who didn't want the trade economy to suffer. Some of the Loyalists fought alongside the British Army. Not surprisingly, the Patriots particularly hated them. In 1776, the new U.S. states passed laws raising taxes on Loyalists, taking away their property, and forbidding them to run for office. Starting in March 1776, almost 100,000 Loyalists fled the colonies. So that tells me that when they started to make things not as great for the Loyalists were like, okay, well, it's been nice, but we'll see you later. Another fight for freedom. In 1775, Virginia Royal Governor John Murray, Lord Dunmore, announced that slaves who fought for the British would be freed after the war, but only slaves owned by the rebels. Hundreds of slaves joined Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment in hopes of a new life. Dunmore wasn't interested in ending the suffering of slaves. He used this offer as a threat towards patriot slave owners. Many of the regiment's members died. So this governor who's on the side with the British, he said, "Oh, hey, if you're a slave and you work for somebody on the other side, if you're on the side that wants independence from the British, you can join my group of soldiers, fight with us against your former owners, and you'll be free afterwards." And he wasn't doing that because he wanted to free slaves. He was doing that to kind of make the life of the people that were fighting for independence. He's trying to make their life not as great. This painting shows the Battle of Jersey in January 1781. The British surrendered at Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781, but the war actually continued for 2 more years. The original colonies in a new light. Why are there so many untrue or partially true stories about the English colonies? Some come from poems or songs, while others may have been exaggerated to give people a sense of patriotism. If people hear a story from only one point of view, they won't have a full understanding of what really happened. Most of history has been written by the winners, the people who received the most benefit. But it's equally important to look at history through the eyes of others. What did the Native Americans think when they saw strange ships arriving on their shores? What did the first African slaves in North America see when they landed in Virginia in 1619? Do some research. The truth might surprise you. All right, that's the end of what we covered today in our Zoom class. I hope that you're keeping up with My Brother Sam is Dead, the read-alouds. And we have a 4-day weekend, so enjoy, and I'll see you next week.